Alright class, welcome to week 3 mood disorders part 1. There's going to be a two-part section. So when we have the quiz, it's going to cover both week 3 and week 4 and also some other content. So please send me an email about any questions that you have regarding the course content. So we have some videos in here. There's been some issues with my YouTube upload, so some of my videos are being removed due to some of these links I have in here. So if you're watching this on YouTube and you're missing videos, just send me an email or go to Kaltura. Or if you're having any issues accessing Kaltura, which is the Illinois media space, send me an email, let me know, and I'll help you out. Alright, so without further ado, here's our video.
I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading till I felt that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating, till I felt my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, as if the heavens were a bell and being were an ear, and I and silence some strange race wrecked, solitary here. Just then, a plank in reason broke, and I fell down and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. We know depression through metaphors. Emily Dickinson was able to convey it in language, Goya in an image. Half the purpose of art is to describe such iconic states. As for me, I had always thought myself tough, one of the people who could survive if I'd been sent to a concentration camp. In 1991, I had a series of losses. My mother died, a relationship I'd been in ended, I moved back to the United States from some years abroad, and I got through all of those experiences intact. But in 1994, 3 years later, I found myself losing interest in almost everything. I didn't want to do any of the things I had previously wanted to do, and I didn't know why. The opposite of depression is not happiness, but vitality. And it was vitality that seemed to seep away from me in that moment. Everything there was to do seemed like too much work. I would come home and I would see the red light flashing on my answering machine. And instead of being thrilled to hear from my friends, I would think, what a lot of people that is to have to call back. Or I would decide I should have lunch, and then I would think, but I'd have to get the food out and put it on a plate and cut it up and chew it and swallow it. And it felt to me like the Stations of the Cross. And one of the things that often gets lost in discussions of depression is that you know it's ridiculous. You know it's ridiculous while you're experiencing it. You know that most people manage to listen to their messages and eat lunch and organize themselves to take a shower and go out the front door, and that it's not a big deal. And yet, you are nonetheless in its grip, and you are unable to figure out any way around it. And so, I began to feel myself doing less, and thinking less, and feeling less. It was a kind of nullity, and then the anxiety set in. If you told me that I have to be depressed for the next month, I would say as long as I know it'll be over in November, I can do it. But if you said to me, you have to have acute anxiety for the next month, I would rather slit my wrist than go through it. It was the feeling all the time, like that feeling you have if you're walking and you slip or trip and the ground is rushing up at you, but instead of lasting half a second the way that does, it lasted for 6 months. It's a sensation of being afraid all the time, but not even knowing what it is that you're afraid of. And it was at that point that I began to think that it was just too painful to be alive, and that the only reason not to kill oneself was so as not to hurt other people. And finally one day, I woke up and I thought perhaps I'd had a stroke, because I lay in bed completely frozen, looking at the telephone, thinking something is wrong and I should call for help. And I couldn't reach out my arm and pick up the phone and dial. And finally, after 4 full hours of my lying and staring at it, the phone rang, and somehow I managed to pick it up. And it was my father. And I said, "I'm in serious trouble. We need to do something." The next day, I started with the medications and the therapy. And I also started reckoning with this terrible question. If I'm not the tough person who could have made it through a concentration camp, then who am I? And if I have to take medication, is that medication making me more fully myself? Or is it making me someone else? And how do I feel about it if it's making me someone else? I had 2 advantages as I went into the fight. The first is that I knew that, objectively speaking, I had a nice life, and that if I could only get well, there was something at the other end that was worth living for. And the other was that I had access to good treatment. But I nonetheless emerged and relapsed, and emerged and relapsed, and emerged and relapsed, and finally understood I would have to be on medication and in therapy forever. And I thought, but is it a chemical problem or a psychological problem? And does it need a chemical cure or a philosophical cure? And I couldn't figure out which it was. And then I understood that actually we aren't advanced enough in either area for it to explain things fully. The chemical cure and the psychological cure both have a role to play. And I also figured out that depression was something that was braided so deep into us that there was no separating it from our character and personality. I want to say that the treatments we have for depression are appalling. They're not very effective. They're extremely costly. They come with innumerable side effects. They're a disaster. But I am so grateful that I live now and not 50 years ago, when there would have been almost nothing to be done. I hope that 50 years hence, people will hear about my treatments and be appalled that anyone endured such primitive science. Depression is the flaw in love. If you were married to someone and thought, well, if my wife dies, I'll find another one, it wouldn't be love as we know it. There's no such thing as love without the anticipation of loss, and that specter of despair can be the engine of intimacy. There are 3 things people tend to confuse: depression, grief, and sadness. Grief is explicitly reactive. If you have a loss and you feel incredibly unhappy, and then 6 months later you're still deeply sad but you're functioning a little better, it's probably grief, and it will probably ultimately resolve itself in some measure. If you experience a catastrophic loss and you feel terrible, and 6 months later you can barely function at all, then it's probably a depression that was triggered by the catastrophic circumstances. The trajectory tells us a great deal. People think of depression as being just sadness. It's much, much too much sadness, much too much grief at far too slight a cause. As I set out to understand depression and to interview people who had experienced it, I found that there were people who seemed, on the surface, to have what sounded like relatively mild depression, who were nonetheless utterly disabled by it. And there were other people who had what sounded, as they described it, like terribly severe depression, who nonetheless had good lives in the interstices between their depressive episodes. And I set out to find out what it is that causes some people to be more resilient than other people. What are the mechanisms that allow people to survive? And I went out and I interviewed person after person who was suffering with depression. One of the first people I interviewed described depression as a slower way of being dead. And that was a good thing for me to hear early on, because it reminded me that that slow way of being dead can lead to actual deadness, that this is a serious business. It's the leading disability worldwide, and people die of it every day. One of the people I talked to when I was trying to understand this was a beloved friend who I had known for many years and who had had a psychotic episode in her freshman year of college and then plummeted into a horrific depression. She had bipolar illness, or manic depression as it was then known. And then she did very well for many years on lithium, and then eventually she was taken offer lithium to see how she would do without it. And she had another psychosis and then plunged into the worst depression that I had ever seen, in which she sat in her parents' apartment, more or less catatonic, essentially without moving, day after day after day. And when I interviewed her about that experience some years later, she's a poet and psychotherapist named Maggie Robbins. When I interviewed her, she said, I was singing, "Where Have All the Flowers Gone?" over and over to occupy my mind. I was singing to blot out the things my mind was saying, which were, you are nothing. You are nobody. You don't even deserve to live. And that was when I really started thinking about killing myself. You don't think in depression that you've put on a gray veil and are seeing the world through the haze of a bad mood. You think that the veil has been taken away, the veil of happiness, and that now you're seeing truly.
All right, so right now, all of you have probably read the Solomon memoir. So I thought it'd be good to put like a face with a name. So when you're looking through this video or you're doing the reading, I want you to think about it. What are some of the risk factors that Solomon had? What are some of the maintenance factors that Solomon had? What are some of the protective factors that Solomon had? Use the information from the video, use the information from the memoir, and put these things together and think about, for his depression, risk factors, maintenance factors, and protective factors. Put them together and think about it. This is something that's going to help you with part one of the assignment. So just, put two and two together, think about it, let me know what you think. So now let's go ahead and get right into the lecture. So today we're going to talk about major depressive disorder. And we're going to talk about the epidemiology, the etiology, interventions, and then in part two we'll get to bipolar. So as we begin discussing specific disorders, I want you to know that it's very common for all of us to experience some form of these symptoms, and we might recognize these symptoms within ourselves. Now, it's very important to understand that these symptoms, these behaviors exist along a continuum. And so for the most part, we all experience them to some degree. And then some of us might experience them more than others. And this might lead to us to get confused and not understand whether or not we have this particular disorder. I want you to know that if you feel like you have this disorder, your mental health is at risk, I would definitely encourage you to reach out to the resources that I listed on Compass, or email me directly if you need help with some of these resources. But I do want you to know that it is common to experience these symptoms to some degree. So first things first, it's important to distinguish the differences between general sadness and major depressive disorder. So for example, like feeling blue or feeling a little bit down, for a while, it's going to be normal, especially in reaction to like a stressful event. This could be like a loss of a loved one, maybe failing a class. But because we're so sad, sometimes we even might say that we feel depressed. But major depressive disorder is much different than feeling depressed. So feeling sad might be part of major depressive disorder, but you do not have to feel sad to be diagnosed with major depressive disorder. So we're going to talk about this more shortly, but if anybody asks, if anybody asks you about the differences between major depressive disorder and, feeling sad, you're going to want to point them towards the core symptoms, which we'll get into in the next slide. So even if the person does have sadness, it is often different from the kind of sadness you will feel if someone dies. There actually are many other symptoms that are required for the diagnosis of major depressive disorder. So I'll go into detail with those a little bit later. But where major depressive disorder differs from normal sadness is the intensity, duration, and the impairment. So when we think about intensity, we want to think about how much suffering does the person experience? How severe is it? What are some of the other symptoms that a person has, and to what degree do they have these symptoms? And then we think about duration. So for duration, we want to think about how long are these symptoms lasting? Is this just like an isolated episode, or is it recurrent in nature? And then we think about the impairment. So impairment, we want to think about how the person's life is impacted. How are they functioning? Can they hold a job? Can they maintain relationships, etc.? We want to put all these into consideration when we're trying to distinguish the differences between just sadness, and major depressive disorder. So depression has a variety of emotional, cognitive, behavioral, and somatic symptoms. So somatic symptoms is going to refer to or physiological or bodily functions. So according to the DSM-5, a diagnosis of depression requires at least 5 of these symptoms for at least a period of 2 weeks, most of the day, nearly every day, one of which must be a core mood symptom. So in order to be diagnosed with major depressive disorder, the person should have either depressed mood or anhedonia. So anhedonia is the loss of pleasure. So for anhedonia, a person may not be sad, but rather they have no interest in things that they usually enjoy doing. So imagine not wanting to play like your favorite sport, spend time with your friends, or go to a favorite restaurant, or do other things you like doing. So a person experiencing anhedonia is going to have a hard time experiencing joy or pleasure. And this has to do with things that they usually enjoyed. Now, additionally, we have some other symptoms. These include weight loss or weight gain. Now, this must be at least 5% of total body weight, either gained or lost, in 2 weeks or less. And dieting doesn't count. An individual must also have sleep problems. This would be insomnia or hypersomnia. Insomnia means that you can't sleep, and hypersomnia means that you sleep too much or have excessive tiredness during the day. You also might have psychomotor agitation, retardation. For agitation, you might have pacing, being fidgety, wringing your hands too much, difficulty sitting still. And then with psychomotor retardation, you want to think about this as slowed bodily movements, long pauses in speaking, things of that nature. Then we also have loss of energy or fatigue. So this is going to be you feeling tired all the time or having a lack of motivation in your movements. Then we have feelings of worthlessness or excessive inappropriate guilt every day. So you want to think of like low self-esteem as not being the same thing as feelings of worthlessness. This is feeling like you have no value. You have no worth as a person. So low self-esteem means that you don't feel as good about yourself as you should. When it comes to worthlessness, it is feeling like you have no value or worth as a person at all. We also have a diminished ability to think or concentrate. This could also lead to indecisiveness. There could also be recurrent thoughts of death, recurrent suicidal ideation, but this is without like a specific plan. But this could include a suicide attempt, right? Or a specific plan on committing suicide. So we're talking a little bit more about the difference between suicidal ideation and then being suicidal. So one thing to talk about when we talk about depression, in the age of like managed healthcare, practitioners often find themselves in a bind of either exaggerating the number of symptoms a client experiences in order to meet diagnostic criteria or to meet the requirements of insurance, or denying patients care. This is one of the things where subthreshold levels of symptoms might still cause clinically significant levels of distress and impairment. And this is some of the issues that we have in the managed healthcare system. Clinicians might want to try to amp up some of these symptoms to help their clients receive insurance reimbursement. Then in some situations, clinicians might lower the severity of those symptoms to avoid giving care to patients. And so this is an ethical issue. So let's go over some key points real quick here about depression. Remember, depression looks different for different people. So you could have a combination of these symptoms. Remember, you must have at least one of the core symptoms. Symptoms of depression can be related and reinforcing in different ways. So there could be connections between the symptoms. So for example, anhedonia might lead to increased feelings of worthlessness. You can't enjoy anything. You used to like all these things. This was a big part of your life, but now you don't. And you feel like, what happened to me? I have no worth as a person. Now remember, you need at least one of the 2 core symptoms, that being depressed mood or anhedonia. Suicide risk increases when people are either taking a turn for the worse or the turn for the better. That transition there increases the risk of suicide. So right here is a quick slide for some criteria for unipolar mood disorder. Remember, major depressive disorder is going to require one depressive episode based on the symptoms described with no manic episodes. So this set of symptoms must last for nearly most of the day, every day, for at least a period of 2 weeks. So we're going to talk about later mania and hypomania are, but right now just know mania and hypomania are not associated with depression. So we distinguish between unipolar and bipolar mood disorders. So bipolar mood disorders are going to include manic, hypomanic episodes. Unipolar mood disorders include depressive episodes. So remember, you cannot have a unipolar mood disorder and a bipolar mood disorder at the same time. All right, so right here, we're going to have Mary. This client is actually great for understanding the presentation of mood disorders. She actually has bipolar disorder, but in this video, we're going to observe Mary in the midst of a depressive episode. So when we talk about bipolar disorder, we're going to also see this client again in the midst of a manic episode. So while watching this, try paying attention to and identifying evidence of depressive symptoms that we just discussed.
When we first interviewed her, she was in the depressed phase of her illness. And then, quite surprisingly, 3 days later, she switched into the manic phase. And so we have the opportunity to show you Mary in both phases of her illness. Please note that certain psychotic symptoms are present in both phases.
We could talk a little bit about the night you had last night. You
Oh,
really had a rough night.
Yes.
Yeah. How did it start? I mean, you mentioned a little bit to me when I came onto the floor this morning.
Well, I was having like a revelation. And the devil was saying something to me. Go get her. She tried to sleep with you. But again, I didn't want to hurt her. But I did.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned voices this morning.
Yeah, I hear lots of voices.
Yeah. And they said something to you about her?
Yeah,
What did they say?
go get her.
Go get her. They say anything else?
You had to kill the devil.
Okay. So you thought she was the devil?
Yeah,
Okay. Has that happened before?
yeah.
Where you got a message like that somebody was
Out
evil.
to get me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why would they be trying to get you?
I don't know.
Have you put together any thoughts about that? I mean, is it because of something that you have or any special position you have in the world?
I feel like I'm on top of the world, looking down on creation, and the only explanation I can find is the love that I've found ever since you've been around is going to put me on the top of the world.
So they're trying to get you because you're on top?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there somebody in particular out there who's trying to get you?
All I can say is the devil.
The devil. Is it kind of like a battle of good against evil?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have anybody on your side?
Yeah. Jesus Christ.
Okay. Okay. What's your relationship to Jesus Christ?
He's my father.
Okay. I mean, a lot of people say Jesus Christ is their father. Do you have a special relationship with him right now?
Yes.
Can you say a little about that?
Just that
You got sidetracked there. Can you tell me what you were thinking, or were you hearing something?
no. I feel like I'm being judged all the time. And I've always said, judge lest ye be judged.
Uh-huh. Who's judging you?
People.
People. Does this situation feel tough to you because of that, feeling judged?
Yeah,
Like kind of like you're being observed or,
a little bit.
Okay. Let me know if it starts to feel uncomfortable because, of course, we're just doing this to do a training or a
Yeah.
teaching thing. But if it starts to fit into some of those other feelings you've had before, it might start to feel uncomfortable. Just let me know if that starts to happen.
Okay.
Just then, were you hearing any voices?
No,
You seem to get distracted a little bit.
I think it's because I have a disease of the brain.
Uh-huh.
There's something wrong with my brain.
What do you think it is?
I want to be a little kid again instead of a grown-up.
Mm-hmm.
Because everything was so calm and cool and collected when I was a little kid, except for when my dad was beating me up.
Yeah, well, that doesn't sound good.
Sometimes I think I'm possessed.
Who are you possessed by?
I don't know.
By someone or something good or
Yeah,
someone or something evil?
something both.
Both.
Sometimes I can't detect which is which, because I shouldn't have done what I did last night. God knows I shouldn't have done that.
Sounds like you feel pretty bad about it.
She was just a little girl.
Mm-hmm. You worried that you hurt her? I think she's okay. I heard she's okay.
And then I hit that one guy.
This was all part of the same thing last night.
No, this was,
Oh, different time?
Got the rest of that video on YouTube. If you want to watch the rest of that video, go ahead and send me an email. I'll send you the link. But what are some of the symptoms that you noticed right there? What are some of the things that you saw Mary exhibit in that video? You can go ahead and pause here, rewind a little bit, and take a look at some of those symptoms. So Mary is exhibiting the signs of very slowed down speech when talking to her clinician. So this behavior maps onto blank, which is one of the possible symptoms of depression. So I want you to think about that. Pause for a second. Psychomotor retardation. Now, some people might say, hey, Walter, what about loss of energy? Well, based on what we observed, this very slowed down speech, this is going to be more along the lines of psychomotor retardation than loss of energy. Now, later on in the video, when she was falling asleep, that would be a sign of loss of energy. So if you have any questions on that, come to office hours or send me an email. In order to qualify for a diagnosis of major depressive disorder, a person must meet criteria for the core symptom, blank, in addition to 4 other symptoms. So is it A, anhedonia, B, depressed mood, C, both A and B, D, either A or B, or E, neither A nor B. So go ahead and take a look at that. Think about it for a second. Remember what we talked about? All right, there we go. So actually it'll be D, either A or B. Remember, you can have either anhedonia or depressed mood. Okay? You don't need to have both of them. You need to have either one or the other. So that means if you have someone with anhedonia and 4 other symptoms, there you go. You have someone in depressed mood and 4 other symptoms, there you go. If you have anhedonia and depressed mood and 3 other symptoms, there you go. If that confuses you, come to office hours, send me an email. We're going to talk a little bit more about major depressive disorder. So it's important for us to understand that major depressive disorder is heterogeneous. So this means not only in primary symptom expression, but also for severity. So there's going to be a number of specifiers in the DSM-5 that help us further clarify the presentation of a disorder. So when it comes to depression, we do have severity specifiers. So for example, right here we have mild. So this is going to be mild impairment, but we still have distress. We're going to have moderate. This is going to be somewhere in between mild and severe. And then we have severe. So this is severe impairment and distress and more than 5 symptoms. So let me ask you a quick question. Think about this for a second. Does this sound objective to you? What do you think? They are subjective. It is based on the clinician's expertise to determine mild, moderate, or severe. This is going to be in conjunction with talking to the client, reaching out to their family to determine whether this is mild, moderate, or severe depression. So these are not objective, these are completely subjective. So now we're going to talk a little bit about remission. Now, when it comes to remission, this is basically going to refer to a reduction in symptom severity, where a person is no longer experiencing clinical levels of symptoms for a disorder. Typically have two remission statuses. Partial remission, where a person is exhibiting a sub-threshold number of symptoms or no symptoms for less than 2 months. And then we have full remission, where a person has had at least 2 months with no symptoms. So as you can imagine, full remission is what we hope for while we're treating depression, but a substantial portion of individuals who are responsive to treatment still experience residual symptoms. There are some additional specifiers that we have for major depressive disorder: anxious distress, peripartum onset with seasonal pattern. So anxious distress is going to be a specifier for major depressive disorder that includes at least 2 of the following symptoms. Those would be feeling keyed up or tense, feeling unusually restless, difficulty concentrating because of worry, fear that something awful might happen, feeling that an individual might lose control of themselves. That would be anxious distress. So for peripartum onset, this actually used to be called postpartum onset, but research showed that it often started during pregnancy. So this would be major depressive disorder with peripartum onset. And the onset of symptoms typically occurs during pregnancy or in the first 4 weeks after delivery. And then we have major depressive disorder with seasonal pattern. This is going to be when there is a regular temporal relationship between the onset of major depressive episodes and a particular time of the year. So for example, this could be the fall or the winter. And then full remission also occurs at a characteristic time of the year. So the depression would disappear in the spring. This would be major depressive disorder with seasonal pattern. That's another specifier. Any questions on that? Come to office hours, send me an email. So typically, we think of depression as being episodic. So we say that people who have major depressive disorder have major depressive episodes. So in contrast, something that is not episodic is referred to as being chronic or stable. So let me give you an example here, like diabetes or another medical condition that a person has their whole life. This would be like nearsightedness, like something that's very persistent. This is going to be something that is chronic, stable. You might have a physical condition, such as like epilepsy. The symptoms come and go in the form of seizures. But a person with epilepsy doesn't experience one constant seizure. A seizure disorder might make someone vulnerable to having a seizure in the future. Similarly, someone who has major depressive disorder is vulnerable to having a major depressive episode, but the symptoms of the disorder, the episode, are not always present. They come and go. So for an episode to be considered separate, a remission period of at least 2 months has to occur. How many major depressive episodes do you see on this chart? Take a look. So episodic suggests that there is a clear start and end to the episodes. So in one moment you're symptomatic, and then later it completely goes away down to baseline. But in reality, the symptoms wax and wane over time. So in this graph right here, we think we have 1, 2, 3 major depressive episodes. But if you look, the remission of the symptoms, it only goes into remission for the month of September, and then the symptoms come back in October. So because that period right there is only 1 month, from July to December, that's 1 major depressive episode. Because remember, to end an episode, you must have no symptoms or subthreshold symptoms for at least 2 months. This is actually how major depressive episodes actually kind of look. You see, we have this rise here, we have high level of symptoms, but then we kind of have subthreshold, kind of goes up, kind of goes down, and it keeps going. So it's kind of hard to distinguish between episodes. But for our purposes, we're going to be discussing this as the reduction of symptoms to a subthreshold level. Now, some research suggests that depression might be better understood as a chronic disorder for many individuals. So like in this graph right here, this kind of depicts a chronic disorder where you always have some level of symptoms and it doesn't really retreat all the way to the baseline, even though you might not meet criteria for an episode. Additionally, 15% of those who have experienced one episode will experience at least one other episode in their lives. And with each episode, the risk of another episode in the future increases. So for example, 80% of people with at least 2 major depressive episodes will have another. Additionally, some individuals experience symptoms of depression that can linger for years, and we're going to talk about this next. So right here, we have persistent depressive disorder. And this is typically longer in duration than a major depressive disorder, but usually less severe in terms of the number of symptoms. So similar to major depressive disorder, persistent depressive disorder has a core symptom that must be present, and this symptom is namely depressed mood for most of the day on more days than not for at least 2 years. So in addition, 2 of these symptoms must be present alongside that depressed mood. There's going to be poor appetite or overeating, insomnia or hypersomnia, low energy or fatigue, low self-esteem. And this is going to, once again, this is different from feelings of worthlessness. You might have poor concentration or difficulty making decisions, and feelings of hopelessness. Now, this is not a symptom of depression, but it is a symptom of PDD. Particularly that it is not going to be as severe as feelings of worthlessness associated with suicidal ideation and major depressive disorder. So with feelings of hopelessness, someone might think that things will never get any better or things will always go wrong for me, rather than I have absolutely no worth. Now, low self-esteem and feelings of hopelessness in this slide right here are italicized because they are not included in the symptoms of major depressive episode, but they are included in the symptoms of PDD. So in order to meet diagnostic criteria for PDD, also known as dysthymia, the symptoms must last for at least 2 years. So dysthymia is just another way of describing PDD. But note that this terminology is technically removed in the new DSM to replace with the name of persistent depressive disorder. But a lot of researchers still refer to PDD as dysthymia. So the person might have brief periods of time without the symptoms, but they will never be without the symptoms for more than 2 months. So right over here, as we can see, you have some level of symptoms for PDD that's lasting over a 2-year time period. So right over here, we have some criteria for unipolar mood disorder. We have major depressive disorder and dysthymia. What would you say if someone had both dysthymia and major depressive disorder at the same time? What would you call that? So the answer is you would call that double depression. So you can have both of these at the same time, where major depressive episodes occur before or during persistent depressive disorder. This is going to be double depression. So basically this means that the person had dysthymia with episodes of major depressive disorder on top of that, or in addition to the dysthymia. So a person who has depressive symptoms, dysthymia, for at least 2 years, but also has more severe periods of depression, major depressive episodes, this is going to be double depression. Now, about 20 to 25% of people diagnosed with major depressive disorder actually have double depression. So right over here, we have this little chart showing us kind of the course of depressive mood disorders. You might see this as being like the normal range. Sometimes you feel good, sometimes you feel bad, but you're within normal limits. This is normal sadness, normal emotional range. Now right over here, this is recurrent major depressive disorder. So this is like someone having at least 2 depressive episodes per year. Then right here, we can see this. This is being chronic major depressive disorder. We don't really use this term anymore. But this would be someone who's having a major depressive episode that lasts 2 years straight. Then next, we have dysthymia. So this is, remember, it's not a major depressive episode, but there is depressed mood and 2 other symptoms for at least 2 years continuous. And then here we would have double depression. This is where someone has persistent depressive disorder, they're dysthymic for an extended period of time, in addition to having major depressive episodes. All right, so let's do a little bit of a review right here. Okay, so since 2015, Shiloh noticed that she felt depressed most of the time, and she has consistently had trouble sleeping and being able to focus on tasks. She makes an appointment to see her therapist because for the last month, these problems have seemed worse. In addition to these 3 worsened symptoms, Shiloh has recently lost a significant amount of weight and also lost interest in some of her favorite activities. Based on this, how might Shiloh's therapist define her concerns? So we're thinking about since 2015. So how many years is that? So trouble sleeping, trouble being able to focus on tasks, feeling depressed most of the time. Now recently, in the past month, these problems have seemed worse. So in addition to these 3 symptoms, the original symptoms that she had, which now feel worse, she has gained 2 more symptoms of losing a significant amount of weight and also losing interest in some of her favorite activities. So based on this, what would you diagnose? Go ahead and pause the video, think about it for a second. Double depression. For a long time, Shiloh has been suffering with PDD, persistent depressive disorder. But recently, her symptoms have increased in severity, and now she has 2 additional symptoms. So she's having a major depressive episode. So remember, if you have PDD, if you meet criteria for PDD, and then you have an MDE, you now have DD. There we go. All right, good job. Here's another one for you. So what are the 2 key symptoms that are present in PDD, but not MDD? All right, there we go. It's going to be feelings of hopelessness and low self-esteem. All right, good job. So this is going to be the COIN study from 1976. It's a study that had to do with interpersonal relationships and depression. So this is an interesting line of research where the researchers were evaluating how interpersonal relationships affect depression or how they are affected by depression. So this COIN study right here, this gave us like a whole new way of thinking about depression and interpersonal relationships. So before this study, many researchers thought that people with depression stayed depressed due to withdrawal. So this is going to be like a subsequent failure to accept supported information from others and other kind of cognitive distortions. So in this study, the researchers asked the following questions. Do people respond differently to people with depression? And how do people feel after interacting with someone with depression? So do people with depression induce depression or hostility in other people? So participants are actually matched with either an outpatient with depression or a control to have a 20-minute phone conversation. So both individuals in the pair were told to compare their current situation to striking up a conversation with a stranger on a bus. And both individuals were told this was a study of the acquaintance process, discuss or withhold whatever kind of information that they wanted to talk about. So following the phone conversation, both subjects and the target filled out a questionnaire about their mood, perception of the other participant, and willingness to interact under various conditions. So, example, this would be, would you like to work with this person? Would you invite them over? Would you invite them into your circle of friends, etc.? So the results of this study found that participants were more anxious depressed and hostile after interacting with people with depression, and that they were more rejecting of the people with depression and were likely to reject opportunities for future interaction if their own mood was depressed following the conversation. These kind of results indicated, like in summary, that depressed patients induce negative mood in those with the people they interacted with. The researchers really didn't know what in the behavior of the depressed person led to negative mood in the participants. So Coyne thought that maybe it was like inappropriate self-disclosure. Patients with the depression were rejected by participants at a higher rate than the other two comparison groups. And finally, the authors concluded that the negative response to others to depressed individuals might make them less likely to interact with those others. This study and a lot of recent studies provided some evidence that people who interact with individuals with depression are going to reject them and also have less positive interactions with them when compared to people who do not have depression. So this is like roommates, inmates, strangers on the phone, dating partners. And this is a very important concept for depression because, as we know, some of the social isolation can make depressive symptoms worse. Now, beyond this study, researchers found trends in depression related to other interpersonal relationships like marriage. So people who are separated or divorced are more likely to be depressed. Depression is higher in those who are never married than those who are married, which might suggest the importance of social support. But also another reason this could be the case, maybe that interpersonal difficulties generally associated with depression may lead individuals to have a harder time in maintaining relationships. There's also a strong relationship between depression and unhappy marriages. So maritally dissatisfied individuals have been shown to be almost 3 times more likely to develop major depressive disorder a year later than dissatisfied individuals. So that means like they get married, you can follow up with them in a year, and they have more major depression as opposed to individuals in satisfied marriages. Depression can also lead to marital problems. So the symptoms of depression are adversive. So why don't you think about depression? Think about how depressive symptoms might cause problems in marriage. Think about how having more responsibilities, taking care of kids, different other kind of domestic financial responsibilities associated with marriage. Think about how, not having fun with your partner in social situations could lead to marital dissatisfaction. Think about like not being interested in sex might lead to dissatisfaction. So this is actually like a potential, feedback cycle. So think about this. You have spouses of people with depression who tend to be more distressed than spouses of people without depression, whether or not marital distress is present, right? So think about how someone with a depression might generate stressful interpersonal conflicts because of cognitive distortions associated with depression. So we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but these kind of cognitive distortions might cause someone to perceive their partner as being uncaring, and might lead them to start an argument. So in particular, spouses with depression might start argument with their partner because their attention is drawn to negative stimuli, and therefore they perceive their partner's behaviors as more negative. There's also reassurance seeking. So this is another idea that we will talk more about later, but this is where a person with depression may be more likely to ask others, including their partner, for reassurance like, "Do you love me?" And then although the partner will typically reassure their spouse that they do love them, the spouse with depression might doubt whether this is genuine. So they'll ask again so that they can continue to receive reassurance. And eventually through this cycle, the partner might get annoyed and might actually end up giving less genuine reassurance to the individual with depression. This will actually make the individual with depression feel more in doubt and likely seek to ask for more reassurance. So you can see how this creates a cycle that leads to more depressive symptoms, and interpersonal conflict. So now let's discuss self-propagatory processes. This is from Joyner 2000. So self-propagation is defined as a complex of psychological and behavioral factors that serve to prolong or exacerbate existing symptoms or induce recurrence of past symptoms. So basically this means that depression and the effects of depression tend to induce one another and propagate themselves. So one of these self-propagatory processes is negative feedback seeking. So this is the idea that basically outlines people who typically desire interpersonal feedback that matches their self-concept, even if one's self-concept is negative. And so people with depression may have a tendency towards relationships that provide negative feedback. So instead of improving their view of themselves, this feedback actually maintains their negative self-view. So researchers have actually found that the desire for self-verification is so powerful that it may override the pain of seeking and receiving negative feedback. And so people with depression are more likely to attend to and remember self-verifying negative feedback. This comes from a need for predictability, control, familiarity, and identity consistency. This push for this negative feedback comes from. And research has also suggested that individuals with a negative self-concept are more satisfied with and more intimate in relationships that provide negative feedback. Now, this need for negative self-verification can invite interpersonal stress, criticism, rejection, and perpetuate depression. So now we have excessive reassurance seeking. So this is going to be the tendency to repeatedly seek assurance from others as to worth and lovability. This is going to be due to low self-esteem, regardless of whether such assurance has already been provided. So like we talked about before, others may provide reassurance, but the individual with depression doubts the sincerity and then seeks to ask for reassurance again. Now through this negative pattern, this kind of establishes a cycle that might lead to frustration, irritation, and even depression in others. And this is going to increase the likelihood that the individual with depression will be rejected. And this maintains or exacerbates their symptoms. We also have interpersonal conflict avoidance. So depressed individuals are going to be associated with having low assertiveness, social withdrawal, avoidance, shyness. So assertiveness is a necessary component of successful conflict negotiation, and it is often quite difficult for people with depression to engage in. So often people with depression might be more likely to avoid social interactions in order to avoid the feared experience of interpersonal conflict or the potential of being humiliated. So interpersonal avoidance is propagated through negative reinforcement or the relief of avoiding a feared interpersonal conflict. In addition, because of this avoidance, there's also a lack of positive reinforcement and low social support, which can exacerbate depressive symptoms. So researchers have found that stressful life events often precede the onset of mood disorders like depression. So for example, 80% of individuals meeting criteria for a depressive episode have experienced a recent major life event or an ongoing stressor. So think about some examples of these stressful life events. This could be divorce, financial problems, illness in yourself or another person, a fight with a friend or family member. Stressful life events might take on the form of significant interpersonal or role loss. So that's like the divorce we were talking about, or maybe even situations that are threatening or of long-term consequences. This could be like financial insecurity or health problems. And alternatively, these symptoms can also cause stressful life events. So, for example, we talked about how symptoms and characteristics associated with depression can cause interpersonal conflict or rejection with others. So, I'll give you an example here of women with histories of major depressive disorder report higher levels of dependent interpersonal stress. This could be like relational conflict. So, remember, we're thinking about how stressful life events can lead to depression, but also how depression can lead to stressful life events. So learned helplessness theory is another factor that might contribute or make an individual vulnerable to mood disorders. This is like going to be their approach to dealing with life's problems. So this learned helplessness theory proposed by Seligman, this was based on research on dogs, not humans. And the main point of the original theory was that individuals who encounter difficult situations that they can't control, it's going to be like child abuse, might feel helpless and give up on trying or even taking a chance on trying to escape a situation. So basically, an individual might experience like aversive events that they are unable to control. And even in the face of new situations, they might not try anything because they have learned that previously it is pointless. Right? So right over here, the way the study worked is you had dogs who were in a cage. There was a little divider between two sides. On one side, the scientists would electrify it. On the other side, they would not electrify it. And so the dog would jump back and forth. And then eventually they would electrify both sides. And then the dog wouldn't jump at all and just be electrocuted. Could you imagine doing the study nowadays? Yeah, it probably wouldn't get approved by the IRB. But back in the olden days, you could do stuff like that. So yeah, so they would be shocking the puppers. So was one important distinction to talk about with learned helplessness. This actually does not explain why some people become depressed or others do not. So you really can't use learned helplessness to differentiate depression within or distinguish who might become depressed, who might not become depressed. This is just one process involved in depression. So with learned helplessness theory, some people just feel like things have been going wrong for so long. There's no way things can get better no matter what I do. Nothing changes. It doesn't matter. I might as well just do nothing. So something else that can lead to depression in individuals is going to be the depressive attributional style. So research suggests that there are certain trends in the interpretation of stressful events that affect the risk factor for depression. Namely, there are three prominent cognitive styles or ways of thinking. There's going to be like the negative attributional style, Beck's cognitive triad, and rumination. So all of these are linked to increased risk, onset, and maintenance of depression. So first, a negative attributional style is where an individual attributes negative events to stable, global, and internal factors. So an internal factor, this is going to be something that is due to yourself or some kind of characteristic of the self and not the situation or anything that's external. Something that is stable is going to be enduring and likely to happen again. And something that is global is likely to affect you in other domains of life. So, for example, an individual might see the experience or event as one that was their fault, that will not change in the future, and is generally problematic rather than specific to a particular event. So let me give you a good example right here. So let's say that you fail a test, and then you interpret this as being something wrong with you, and then you conclude that you are stupid. That would be internal, rather than recognizing that it was just a really hard test. So in addition, based on this one exam, you might conclude that you are terrible at everything, global, rather than recognizing that it was just this one test. In addition to this, you might see this as being unchanging and leading to a pattern of failure in the future, stable, which could contribute to the development of depression. So in that example, you have the attributions are stable, right? So typically they're referring to some kind of like enduring personality trait rather than their particular reaction at that point in time, right? That would be like an unstable view. Global, so this is going to be like vague and generalized across many situations rather than specific to that situation. And internal, attributed to some personal issue, such as like, something with yourself rather than it's like a unique external issue. So just to recap real quick, with this attributional style, this is going to be an explanation. This is going to be your explanation or an individual explanation for an event. So people who have an internal attributional style blame themselves for negative events. People who have an external attributional style blame negative events on the environment. And the internal attributional style is linked with depression. The external attributional style is not linked with depression. So similarly, Aaron Beck coined the negative triad of depression. So this describes how individuals with depression tend to have negative thoughts about the self, the world, and the future. So in particular, Beck talks about the triad in terms of depressive schemas. So a schema is a general cognitive pattern that guides the ways in which people perceive and interpret events in their environment. Schemas are enduring and highly organized representations of prior experience. So a depressive schema is a risk factor to depression in the face of failure events. So some of these examples include assigning global personal meanings to failure. So like you get turned down for a job, you didn't get an A on an exam, you think maybe you're a loser, it's all your fault. You start overgeneralizing conclusions about yourself. So, oh, if this person doesn't go on a date with me, they must think I'm stupid and ugly. And also like exaggerating the importance of negative events and discounting the importance of positive events. So thinking that, oh yeah, I graduated, but my GPA was a 3.5. This is a great example for like instructors, right? So you have like hundreds of students and then like 5 of them don't like you. And you think, man, these 5 students don't like me. Doesn't matter what these other hundreds of students think. Because these 5 students don't like me, I'm not a good teacher. It's things like that. So remember, this is going to have different features. I've listed them out here for you, like low self-worth, low self-esteem, belief that whatever happens is uncontrollable, expectation that future events are also going to be uncontrollable, and having a sense of helplessness and hopelessness. Biology can contribute to the development of psychopathology, and this is in the form of neurotransmitters. So specifically, current theories of depression emphasize the interaction between neurotransmitter symptoms. This is going to be like serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, and neuropeptides. So for those of you who don't know, with serotonin, this is going to be a neurotransmitter that reduces anxiety and instills a sense of serenity. And this is often the neurotransmitter that we most closely associate with depression. Such that we actually find that people with lower levels of serotonin are at a greater risk for depression. And in fact, a lot of antidepressants specifically target serotonin levels. We'll get into more on this a little bit later. Now you have dopamine. This is responsible for feelings of pleasure and reward. So if low levels of serotonin might increase anxiety, then low levels of dopamine are going to decrease the feelings of pleasure or reward, which could be associated with anhedonia. And then we have epinephrine, norepinephrine. So this is adrenaline. This is your fight or flight response. So a dysregulation in the epinephrine, norepinephrine could increase the amount of worry that you have about future uncertain events. But a low level could also lead to a lack of energy, a lack of motivation. All right, so we talked about twin studies before. As you know, this is my favorite thing. So with twin studies, we have concordance rates right here for depression. So for unipolar depression, the concordance rates in monozygotic twins is 0.54 and dizygotic twins is 0.24. So what does this mean for you? So this kind of suggests that there is a mild genetic influence for unipolar depression. And also environment is likely important since, the monozygotic twins is significantly lower than 100%. So there might be some kind of environmental factor in there. Now remember, there is no strong evidence for a single gene responsible for mood disorders. Rather, unipolar mood disorders seem to be polygenic in nature. Remember, polygenic means that many genes exert small effects. So Caspi et al. Had a study looking at gene by environment interactions. So we know that stress leads to depression in some people, but not others. So researchers are very interested in understanding what differentiates individuals by studying gene by environmental interactions. Caspi et al. Assessed the level of genetic risk based on the serotonin transporter gene in a prospective longitudinal study with about 1,000 subjects. So as I mentioned before, you have two short alleles of the serotonin transporter gene. This was going to indicate a high genetic vulnerability for depression because there is less serotonin, whereas two long alleles indicate the lowest genetic vulnerability because there's more serotonin. Two short alleles, you're going to have a high genetic vulnerability due to low serotonin. Two long alleles, you're going to have a low genetic vulnerability because of high serotonin level. This is one of the slides we looked at before. So here we see the number of stressful life events increases. People who have a higher genetic vulnerability are more at risk of developing depression. So also without the genetic vulnerability, stressful life events do not predict depression. This is an example right here of a gene by environment interaction. All right, here's a little practice for you. Brandy fails an exam and has the automatic thought, I am so stupid, instead of recognizing that half of the class also failed the exam. Thinking about OChem here. So what kind of attributional style is this? A, internal, B, stable, C, global, D, external, E, social. Answer is A, internal. Remember, internal means is a characteristic of the self. It's not associated with the situation. Stable means that it's likely to happen again. This is persistent. And global means this is likely to affect you in other domains of your life. So that means you do something bad at work, you're going to do something bad at school, you do something bad at school, you're going to do something bad in your relationships. It applies to other domains of your life. All right, so going back to Caspi et al., there's going to be two major findings from the study. Findings are the effect of life events on depression symptoms was significantly stronger among those with the genetic vulnerability, and stressful life events predicted major depressive disorder as well as suicidal ideation and attempts only among those with a genetic vulnerability. And the takeaway from here is that depression symptoms tend to be more severe among individuals with both genetic vulnerabilities and several major life stressors. When looking at major depressive disorder, the average age of onset is going to be 32. So we're going to talk about some of the sex differences a little bit later. Major depressive disorder is frequently a long-term and recurrent condition. So 75% of people who have major depression will also have at least two depression disorders. So half of individuals with major depressive disorder will recover within 6 months. 40% of people who recover will relapse within a year. So what that means is if you have a major depressive episode, then you go into remission, either full or partial remission, usually within 6 months. But 40% of people who recover will relapse, which in the context of major depressive disorder means they will have another major depressive episode within a year. So right here, we have some stats and epidemiology of major depressive disorder. Now, typically we see that women between the ages of 18 and 25 and those with multiple racial or ethnic backgrounds are going to have the greatest 12-month prevalence for major depressive disorder. 70% of people with major depressive disorder or persistent depressive disorder also have another psychological disorder at some point in their lives. So this comorbidity data right here is from the National Comorbidity Study, where they surveyed 8,000 non-institutionalized adults between the ages of 15 and 54. Now, using these clinical interviews, this study found that depression is also highly comorbid with other disorders, particularly anxiety disorders like generalized anxiety disorder and social phobia. Additionally, evidence from twin studies shows that the comorbidity between anxiety and depression may be due to some genetic factor, and comorbidity is associated with worse outcomes and functioning. So right over here, we have some sex differences between males and females. As you can see right here, starting at age 13, these sex differences emerge, and this is where females are more likely than males to develop depression. This is stable throughout adulthood. So where you see the lines converge and diverge is interesting, as this is roughly when puberty begins. So there seems like there's these pubertal differences between males and females might contribute to the development in depression. But this pubertal differences, this timing, might not just be to hormones alone. You might also think about this as this timing might interact with different kinds of stressors. So let's think of the kinds of stressors that might be experienced in this pubertal stage. You might think of like puberty interacting with abuse. This could be sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. Maybe we have dysfunction in the family. We have like a negative body image. Maybe we have like changes in peer relationships. Right? We can think like how between males and females, the kind of violence we might encounter being like child sexual abuse, domestic violence, other forms of sexual victimization. We could have chronically stressful roles. So, for example, between males and females, maybe there's more expectations for females to be both to have dual roles, to be like providers, but also to be caregivers. We can also might think of like disadvantaged status, how, between males and females, females might have less power and control in their lives. They might be paid less for their jobs or assigned jobs with lower status and therefore be poorer. We might think about socialization as well. We might think about how females are socialized to ruminate more than males. So rumination is dwelling over negative situations, and males might actually respond to these negative situations by distracting themselves or taking action, like negative action, like punching people or getting into arguments or just like drinking or other things like that. You might think of how females are socialized to seek out help and express their feelings more than males, and then males might just be less socialized to talk about it and to suck it all up. This actually means or could indicate that there are no actual sex differences in depression. Maybe the differences are based on reporting. So due to like toxic masculinity, maybe men just don't report their depressive symptoms or talk about it, but women are socialized or females are socialized to talk about it more. This could also be due to socialization about body image and other interpersonal events. So for example, females might be socialized to put a higher importance on body satisfaction, and then this could lead to body dissatisfaction due to distorted norms about beauty, which might not affect males at the same rate. And this could make females more vulnerable to automatic thoughts, resulting in depression. Remember, this is not to say that females are the only ones that experience body dissatisfaction. As we'll talk about a little bit later, males also express forms of body dissatisfaction as well. All right, so right here, I forgot that I didn't put those slides up for you, but you should have the slides printed out. Take a look at that right there. Pause the video. Boom, boom, boom. Got a question there for you, some review. So which of the following is one of the possible explanations for the sex differences in depression? A, males are more likely to experience chronic stressful roles. B, males may simply be underreporting depression. Males are more likely to ruminate than females. Male self-worth is more often tied to body image. Male's testosterone level acts as a protective factor. Okay. A, B, C, or D? Which one is it? There you go. It is B. Males may simply be underreporting depression due to what? Toxic masculinity. Keep that in mind. Toxic masculinity is a thing. So, it cuts both ways. It disadvantages a lot of people. Okay, so right here we have some information about employment and income when it comes to major depressive disorder. So right over here on the left, you see a chart for employment. And we're going to have on the y-axis, we have their percent of individuals with depression. And then on the x-axis, we have currently employed, currently unemployed, unemployed less than 6 months, unemployed more than 3 months. And as you see right here, the first column right here, you have individuals who are currently employed. 2.2% of them have major depressive disorder. So then the prevalence rate for people who are unemployed is 3.4%. The prevalence rate for individuals Recently unemployed for less than 6 months, 2%. And then unemployed more than 6 months is 6.1%. So this kind of indicates here that employment is a kind of protective factor against depression. Then right over here, we have income. In the first column right here, we have income under $15,000 and income over $15,000. As you see right here, the prevalence of depression is higher in low-income individuals, which indicates that there's some sort of a risk factor there. So let's think about what it means, right? So let's think about what might be causing individuals with lower income to be more depressed than individuals with higher levels of income. Now, this is not to say that if you have a lot of money, you're not going to have depression, but this shows that depression is greater in low-income individuals than high-income individuals. So let's think about this. Let's think about the kinds of stressors associated with poverty, right? Let's think about how, maybe you have more difficulty paying your bills. You have less access to mental health resources. You don't have a lot of benefits. You're struggling to feed yourself. You're struggling to take care of responsibilities that you have. Or what if you're a single parent? Now you have to work and take care of your kids and figure out daycare situations. I remember I had a conversation with somebody who said, money doesn't buy happiness. I said, yeah, but it's easier to feel happy if you get a flat tire, if you can change that flat tire, than if you can't afford to change that flat tire. And for some people, that's a big issue. So think about some of the stressors that you have, right? And think about how those could be exacerbated if you didn't have the money to take care of it. Imagine a situation where your tuition's due, but you can't pay it and you don't have any benefits. Think about that kind of stressors, right? Maybe some of you are undergoing those stressors, but think about that. And think about some of the other things that might occur with individuals with low socioeconomic status who are unable to take care of themselves or receive the help that they need. So there's also some cultural differences when it comes to depression. So researchers have found as often difficult to compare depression across cultures due to differences in language and social norms. So in addition to these differences in language and social norms, symptoms are not always interpreted or expressed the same way. So some cultures might discourage overt appearances of sadness or may express their symptoms in terms of somatic or bodily complaints. Certain cultures view depression as being as heartbreak. In other cultures, some African nations and Asian and Latin cultures, there's actually going to be more somatic complaints where they're going to express depression as some kind of sensation in the body, some kind of physiological experience. Western medicine are now adopting a more Western view of depression and looking more towards the emotional and the cognitive factors and less reliant on the somatic factors. However, with all these differences in account, most studies still indicate that clinical depression is a universal, even though some of the descriptions of symptoms across cultures might change. Researchers have found that individuals of varying ethnic backgrounds are generally afflicted equally across their lives, even though the amount of treatment or the amount of diagnoses might differ. All right, so let's talk about age real quick. So depression is less common among the elderly. People once thought that elderly were at a greater risk of depression. Research has definitely found that elderly individuals are less likely to experience depression. However, certain subgroups of the elderly are more prone to depression. So you can think of some populations being individuals who are in residential care, individuals who have chronic health issues. These individuals might have higher rates of depression compared to other elderly individuals, but overall it'll be lower rates of mood disorders than younger adults. Additionally, there are some cohort effects. So people born recently tend to have a higher risk of developing depression at an earlier age than previous generations. So for example, those born after World War II are more likely to develop mood disorders, and have an earlier age of onset than those from previous generations. This could be for a variety of factors. This could be to underreporting of older individuals. This could be to greater awareness of mental health concerns, or this could be a great awareness of stressors in life and society. So now we're going to talk a little bit about medication when it comes to depression. So there's going to be a variety of medications that are used to treat depression. There's going to be a particular emphasis on selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs. So these medications are going to increase the levels of serotonin. However, there are a large number of side effects associated with SSRIs. This includes weight gain, loss of sex drive, and nausea. There are also TCAs, which are tricyclic antidepressants, and MAOIs, which are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. These also have robust effects on monoamine neurotransmission. Now, TCAs block the reuptake of monoamines in the neuron, and the MAOIs prevent their breakdown once reabsorbed. So this actually would enhance the effects of a neurotransmitter like serotonin. So you have SSRIs, TCAs, and MAOIs. Go ahead and look those up. Remember those for the quiz. So when it comes to psychotherapy for treating depression, there are two popular forms. There's IPT and CBT. So IPT is going to be interpersonal psychotherapy. So interpersonal psychotherapy suggests that interpersonal stress and lack of support is what causes depression. So in IPT, the clinician and patient are going to focus on factors in current relationships that cause and maintain depressive symptoms. So this often involves activities like role playing in order to practice specific social skills. And the primary goal here is to improve social communication and problem solving skills. So IPT is going to be based on the premise that interpersonal distress is connected with psychological symptoms. So in acute interpersonal crises, a stressor begins the process. And the ability of the patient to manage the crises psychologically and biologically is heavily influenced by the patient's biopsychosocial vulnerabilities. So these are also referred to as diatheses. Now, like a genetic vulnerability to illness, temperament, attachment style, and personality, these can all be viewed as factors that might place somebody at a greater risk for interpersonal distress and exacerbate crises. There are social factors like the patient's current significant relationships, and then other levels of social support that might provide a context for which the stress diathesis interaction occurs. And this might further modify the individual's ability to cope with their distress. So again, these elements from the interpersonal triad, this is the figure on the screen for you, this is going to model the basic IPT conceptualization of the development of psychological distress. Now also we have CBT. So CBT operates under the premise that maladaptive thoughts are what cause depression. So the focus of CBT is restructuring maladaptive thought patterns through critical reflection, and CBT is going to focus on restructuring the cognitive distortions, negative thinking, and internal attribution styles that we talked about earlier in the lecture. People with depression are affected by these cognitive distortions, but also people with bipolar disorders are affected by these distortions when they're having major depressive episodes. Now, CBT involves teaching clients about patterns of thought and behavior that are more realistic and can minimize the risk of relapse. CBT also provides information about the importance of medication compliance, like make sure you're taking your medication, and it also emphasizes the importance of proper sleep skills and also psychoeducation that allows an individual to recognize when their symptoms are starting to flare up. So right over here, we have an example of CBT. Let's say we have an example right here of an event that occurs. This event is individual received a B on a quiz. So the person maybe feels that they really need to get an A on that quiz. So there might be like an emotion associated with that result, which could be sadness, hopelessness. This is like resulting in an automatic thought of, I'm just no good. So then you might ask the individual, well, what kind of evidence supports this thought of being no good, and the client might say that, well, I didn't do well on the quiz or submit an assignment on time. This is the evidence of why I'm no good. Then a clinician might probe a little bit deeper and ask for what kind of evidence contradicts or does not support this thought. So you might say, well, what are some other areas of life where I'm succeeding at? So, oh, I'm a good friend, or I'm a good cook. This could be something that increases your self-esteem, review of yourself. Then the clinician might also ask the individual to restructure the thought in light of new information. So this might be that although I didn't do well in the quiz in the past week, I am a good friend, I am a good cook, so this doesn't mean that I'm no good. And then as a result of restructuring this automatic thought, the client can feel good about themselves, they can feel relieved, they can feel like they have some hope in this world. So researchers have often looked at different types of therapy to see what is more effective at treating depression. The Treatment of Depression Collaborative Research Program, this is the TDCRP, this wanted to compare the effectiveness of psychotherapy and antidepressants. So they compared IPT, CBT, and antidepressant conditions to a placebo plus clinical managed conditions for 16 weeks. So that placebo was just like treatment as usual. So what they found was that these interventions were all superior to placebo, the placebo plus clinical management condition, over the course of 16 weeks. For those of you who may or may not know, a placebo condition is what we compare actual interventions against to see if it's more effective than a situation in which no actual treatment is given. So in medicine, you might think of a clinical trial as trying to determine if a medication is effective. After going through this study, they actually found that therapy was just as effective as medication. So the medication led to a more rapid improvement initially. However, the effects of all interventions were equivalent over the course of 16 weeks. The type of improvement was independent of the type of treatment. So for example, medication changed cognitions just as much as cognitive therapy. We have a little chart coming up for you. Here you can see that the antidepressants initially improved mood faster than the other treatments, but over the course of 16 weeks, they all kind of leveled out. Some people might ask, why do some individuals use therapy instead of medication? Some people just might not want to use medication. This could be from the side effects, the way it makes them feel. So about 40% of patients actually stop taking medication. This is why therapy is important. Research has found that therapy could be just as effective as medication for people with recurrent depression, and it could be helpful for people who are, unwilling or unable to tolerate the antidepressants. Also, therapy, medication, they can be equally as effective, so there's no need for medication in some circumstances, but this doesn't mean that nobody should ever receive medication. It just depends on the individual. This is why it takes a collaborative effort to help clients to achieve the outcomes that they need. So that's going to be it for our lecture this week, Mood Disorders 1. Remember to come to office hours. Remember to send me an email if you have any questions. Log back in next week. Check for the next lecture where we cover bipolar disorders, and mania and hypomania. And that's it.